Good afternoon and welcome to Discernment Radio. I'm your host, Danielle Pailly.
And I'm your host, Cindy Riednauer. We are Discernment Radio, people and topics to enhance your life.
So Cindy, I wanted to get your perspective because you are a spiritual seeker and a life coach. I was actually speaking with a colleague recently and I was writing an article about loneliness, and we know just loneliness is such an epidemic, both in the U.S. and the U.K., and it's the cause of a lot of health risk associated with being lonely, particularly older adults who maybe their spouses have passed or some of their friends have passed. And my colleague mentioned that she spoke to a woman who said, I'm engaged in all these activities, I'm constantly going out with friends, but I'm lonely for the one person I can't have, which was her husband who had passed, many years ago. And I know there's no way to write an article or say anything that's going to cure loneliness for somebody who is grieving. But I was wondering if that's the place where a person's faith or belief system kind of steps in. What do you think?
I do think that. I have a friend who, she's in her early 80s, and she lost her husband to cancer back in their 60s. But she has such a firm belief that he still exists, that his soul is still nearby, that she does all sorts of things for him and imagines the energy of what she's doing being sent to him on the other side. And every Valentine's Day, which was their wedding anniversary, she blocks out the entire day. She doesn't do anything but stays home alone, and she imagines herself dancing with him in the living room. She makes dinner for him and has a romantic evening, gets flowers, whatever they would have done together. And that is her memorial to him every year. But she also believes that she can talk to him on the other side, and she feels like her thoughts are being received. And she has such an absolute faith in that has kept her going.
And I kind of believe that myself. My parents have passed, and I believe if I sit in meditation and I talk to them or think thoughts, that they can hear me, and if I'm quiet, I'll get messages back, be it an actual idea in my head, kind of hearing what they would say if they were here, or even just symbols in nature, or something that shows me that they're there and they're present. And to me, that's very comforting. Though I wonder, number one, if somebody were an atheist or they didn't have that belief system, like how do you advise someone? Because I really like this suggestion, like with this woman. What would you say to somebody who doesn't believe, who thinks they're gone, they're just gone?
Well, I think in that case, you have to go back to more psychological type methods of saying, okay, what did you enjoy about this person? What was your life together like that you remember in good ways? And then is there a way to pay respects to that person? Could you start a foundation? Can you support a charity of the way they died, or perhaps something that was near and dear to their heart, and in that way maybe feel closer to them?
Oh, that's a really good suggestion. Because to me, I find my belief comforting, and I was trying to think of how do you comfort somebody who maybe has a different perspective. Either they don't believe, or in some cases they believe they will be reunited in death, but that person is inaccessible to them. So I like that idea. I also wonder, because if I have the practice of sitting and thinking about somebody, and you mentioned this woman who had the practice of actually planning this entire day, what it would be like if you advised someone, well, if they're imagine them sitting in front of you, what would you say to them? Imagine what would they say to you, if hearing that could be helpful. Because I also know people who have suffered great loss and they're not moving on. And we know, it can take 5 years just to come out of a deep loss, and sometimes longer depending on the person, or what would that person say to them. Because I don't think that whomever has passed wants the person who's grieving to stop living. And sometimes that's what happens, where a person is just waiting until they die so they can be reunited. And that's not healthy. So what suggestion would you have?
Well, I would advise somebody maybe to sit down and write a letter, just as with those people that aren't in your life anymore for other reasons. a friend who's moved on, moved away, and you don't have any contact, you can always write a letter and get out some of your feelings, just like you do with journaling. It helps cleanse your emotions.
Yeah, I've read two different perspectives on that, and I would be curious what you think. I used to read that if you journaled about something that is unpleasant, and you write it and you get it out of your system, it's as if you had gone to several therapy sessions. And then some positive psychologists have said, well, if you write down negative things, then you're reinforcing it. And so you should write positive things. So, different perspectives. I kind of have my opinion, but I want to get your opinion on that first.
Okay. Well, I think that anytime you hold in something and you don't express it, you're affecting your health and your well-being. So I would be a proponent of writing down anything that you need to get out, get off your chest. And then if you need to, burn it, rip it up, flush it away,
where I was going
bury
with
it, get rid of it. And then you can write down the positive things. But I don't think that you should try and all be just happy and cheerful when you're not feeling happy and cheerful.
Definitely. And that was exactly what I was going to say. If I'm writing down negative things, and that's actually a point of practice for me, write it down and then burn it, tear it up, something to get rid of it. But keep the good memories, writing down the things they enjoyed doing together. And you're right. It's not a question when somebody is grieving to say, just get over it. They do need time to kind of sit with that feeling and allow themselves to feel that way.
Another point I think that is necessary is forgiveness. And a lot of times when people lose someone, when they die, they feel abandoned. And they actually, even though they maybe don't want to acknowledge it, they're actually harboring some ill will against the person for being left behind. A lot of people say, well, why didn't I go first? I would have rather have gone first. Yeah. And so you almost have to forgive that person for leaving you too, and acknowledge that they didn't want to, but that's the way it happened.
That's so interesting because and I've heard that, and you wonder why that is, and I think that's just part of grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I did a process years ago of forgiveness, which was called Rohan. And one of the things they would do is you would get into a very relaxed state, and any thoughts, any feelings, any emotions that you felt you were ready to let go of, you envisioned a cloud up in the sky, and you put those thoughts, the feelings or emotions into the cloud, and you just let the wind drift it away. And then if you weren't ready to really get rid of it, you could call it back or let it come back to you. But if you were absolutely certain that you're ready to move on and ready to let it go, then it just drifted away.
I think that's a very good spiritual practice in general.
Mm-hmm.
Just meditating and imagining what doesn't serve you anymore just floating away.
Yes, absolutely.
And just attracting in that light. And we've interviewed people in the past where Jean Walters, where she'd say, imagine somebody's in the light with you.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you're grieving for someone too, that would be a wonderful thing to imagine that person that you've lost in light with you.
Yeah, I think it's important too for people to find what they believe in, because for us, we know what we believe. But I wonder with loss, in helping somebody, say, who's very religious, who thinks that that person is in heaven, I guess, if there's a feeling that you can communicate with that person, it feels not softer, it doesn't make it easier, but it's a little different than being disconnected. So, I'm wondering if it would cause people to actually explore what they believe when they're in that state and find kind of a sense of purpose, a sense of spirituality that they might not have had before.
Well, I think also if you look at people with the practices of cemeteries and graves, a lot of people like to return to there and actually talk to their loved one because they feel that that's a physical representation of the person. And even people who maybe don't believe about them going to another place or heaven or whatever, they seem to find solace in being able to talk to them there. Other people, which the beliefs we share, we feel we don't have to be at a certain place, that you can talk to them anywhere.
But that's part of their ritual, and I think that's very important. And I also think it's important, though, to not isolate. So I think, say, if the woman we started speaking about were in front of me, I would probably advise, like said, plan the time. What would you say to that person, or write to that person, or do something meaningful about that person, but then seek out support. Whether it's through therapy, whether it's through a group grief center, whether it's through being around friends and family, because I think the opposite can happen. You can spend so much time connecting with that person who's gone that you're disconnecting from life.
Absolutely. So what do you think are some takeaways we could leave with people?
So I really like when you had mentioned starting a charity, or in some way being involved with some volunteer opportunity that would represent that person. Perhaps that person, whether it's an illness or whether they happen to like animals or something that relates to that person. So I like that, number one. I really like the idea of journaling, whether it's to either get out emotions or write down the things you loved and the positive memories. I like that a lot. I also like the idea of talking to the person and even sitting in meditation for those who believe their message does get out there. And for those who don't believe, just to imagine, what would that person say? How would they advise you in that situation?
And I think you could also advise them to take some baby steps to maybe try something new and go into a new phase of their life. Very slowly and very gently, but that is what's going to help them in the long run.
Yeah. And I guess, too, just also understanding the process, because everybody grieves differently. And I know there's a tendency for, if you see somebody not getting past it fast enough, you want to kind of guide them. And understanding that it could take years. It's not an overnight thing. And it's not a just get over it, but to help kind of guide them through the process. And definitely seek out support in some way, not just isolate themselves. And you had told me a very odd story about a woman, and I would have a hard time knowing how to approach it.
This is about a woman who had some difficulty in her marriage before her husband got cancer. And it was to the point where it looked like it was going to be a very difficult divorce, very confrontational. And so when her husband got cancer and she had to do all these caretaking tasks for him, she was shocked and traumatized by that. And then when he passed away, she went into a very intense period of grief, which shocked everybody, because the people that knew that the marriage had been falling apart previously thought that she would cope better. So for her, it was very difficult to give her any support because the grief was so intense that she didn't seem to accept it. But she did get into a support group, and she did go to counseling. And I think that at least made her able to cope better.
Yeah, and I've heard that happening before, where people are having marital trouble, somebody gets sick and they die, and then the person who's left is suddenly remembering all the good things, and there was no closing that situation. And I'm curious in this case if by taking care of him there was some kind of renewed their marriage in some way, or if it was just that she had a purpose and now she's lost that purpose.
I think it probably was more of the latter.
Yeah.
Because I think the caretaking was so intense for her that she had trouble even coping with the demand of it.
Mm-hmm. So in her case, it's all, not only seeking support, but kind of finding a renewed purpose, and as you said, trying something different and seeing, what new is out there.
But I do think, too, if you have somebody else that is depending on you, like if you have children, this is a time where you need to pull out whatever inner strength you have and make sure that you're taking care of the kids, that you're not abandoning them from their normal routine, and seeking any type of support and help that you can so the kids are okay.
Yeah. And I guess there's just one more thing. How do you, as somebody offering support, it could get draining. If you have years of somebody who's going through that and you want to be there for them, how do you support people who are being almost a caregiver in that sense, and not push that person away? Because in the person that you referenced, she, as I understand it, became very reliant on other people.
Yes.
And I could imagine that being draining on somebody saying, yes, I want to be supportive, but I can't be there 24/7. So I almost think it's important to have social support of more than one person, have at least 3 people
Absolutely.
that you can they almost need to congregate and kind of take turns.
Yes. Caregiving is an exhausting task. There's no doubt about it. And I think that if you see somebody who's sad, you have to give them space to be sad. But if they're getting into depression, then they may need medical help or psychological help that maybe you can't give. And so you have to realize that you can only help somebody up to the level that you have the expertise to do it.
Good point. And we should say we are not therapists. We are
That's correct.
spiritual seekers having a discussion about how we would talk to somebody from a spiritual perspective. So thank you for pointing that out. You've been listening to Discernment Radio with Cindy Riednauer and Danielle Pailly. Thanks for joining us today. If you like the show, please click to follow.